Hey everybody, welcome back to the WBF podcast. I'm here with Greg Thompson. Greg, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, so
Cooling
you're
off.
Yeah, cooling off. Yeah, this room is a lot colder than it is. This is like pretty hot day. But so you're lifelong friends of my dad. So you know how long ago did you meet my dad?
He thought I was the weird guy all the way through our school. From sixth grade, sitting behind him in homeroom, all the way through high school. And then ironically, we met up at hanging out Sonic, the old cruise circuit, and he pulls up in his Jeep, and I think music was our first connection, and talking and just riffing about stuff. And just we became ultimate friends that summer, and that was the summer after high school. That would have been 79.
Wow. The Golden Eagle Jeep, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
He's told me a few stories about that Jeep and how he buried it and wasted a lot of money on that thing. It would have been worth a lot of money.
His money funnel was the Camaro. He always had the hot rod project, and the Jeep is his primary.
Yeah.
But he always joked about he wanted to push the Jeep, and it said it had a safety mechanism. It'd stall if he tried to make it go fast.
Yeah. So you born and raised in Paducah? Or?
Yeah, Lone Oak most of my life. Started third grade in 69 in Lone Oak. A quick version of my background. I say that God became a surrogate parent of mine, and when my mother dedicated me as a baby, I think God honored her prayer in a sincere way instead of it just being the formality of a church thing. She knew that she wasn't up for the task, and my parents continued to separate every 3 years for my growing up period until they finally divorced at the beginning of my senior year. And but it's like God assigned, I don't know if it was the Holy Spirit or an angel, a presence to translate what was going on to the mind of a child, that I didn't take the typical damage from all that. I was weighing, I could see the humanity of when they would fight when I was as early as 5 or 6 years old. Now, I explain that.
Right.
In the natural, there's no explanation for that. But my life, growing up here, my trajectory toward my adult life was the dual thing. I had a grandmother that talked to me about Bible prophecy all the time, so I grew up thinking I'm not going to see 1984, from, and I guess I did base my so-called career path on that. I didn't really. My mantra over me was like the first PTA meeting I remember going to with my parents when I was in fifth grade. They said Greg has the potential, but he doesn't apply himself. And ironically, we're here to talk about Kaleb. But the parallels of his life were so similar to mine in those different key points of life. Yeah. And he saw his mom and dad, me and Barbie separated, for when Kaleb was about 11 to 12. And very unplanned for me, Yeah. But it was a God lesson, getting my attention on priorities. And
it's interesting how those things kind of repeat themselves in your lives, because you grew up with that, your parents getting back together and separating, and then you get old enough to do it yourself, and you're thinking, I'm never going to do that to Kaleb. I'm never going to do that.
I was never going to become the cats in the cradle dad with Kaleb, and I did from about age 8 to 12. Yeah. And while we're on that subject, I'm bad about talking in circles, but I grab them when they're available.
Please do.
I would tell any dad out there listening, the key here is don't get too busy. You think you're doing the right things, and that was me. I thought I'm just trying to make things work, and I was doing it. It wasn't deliberate pride, but I was kind of leaving God out of it. I was doing my thing and asking God to bless it, and it was turning into a disaster. Resentments were building between Barbie and I. I was no longer in a relationship with Kaleb. I was his on him all the time, and sowed a lot of regret. And the key example I use in that is I went from, it was that path of good intentions. I went from literally, figuratively, that's a worn out word, but in my mind and heart, I was building the blanket tent with him with the dining room tables and doing that with him, and I never did. And suddenly 8 turns into 12, and he goes from that would have been cool to him to then he's on skateboards and graduated to bicycles, and he doesn't care about that anymore. And I've lost that period of his life. And I will give God and myself credit for how he was raised in that initial 8 years, but I dropped the ball, there for a time with him and Barbie. And she wrote me in the letter when she left. She said, I think God wants me to do this. And even your dad was saying, had the feeling of, oh, yeah, right. That's what they all say, but we weren't giving God any credit at the time. I was just bewildered, blindsided. As Greg Laurie once preached, the chickens had come home to roost. And that builds over time and you don't see it. Or the forest for the trees thing, is that analogy. And it happens. And... But it turns out that was right. It was God, absolutely getting my attention. And he spoke to my heart when I was looking for answers. And it was the day your dad came by to pray with me as a concerned friend. She had gone on September 14th of 2008 on Saturday. And I was all in that weekend. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was ashamed. And I thought... And I'm thinking all those wild thoughts like, yeah, mom and dad made it 18 years and I'm cursed. My marriage is cursed. I'm cursed with divorce. And I'm reaching and I'm blaming myself. I'm not doing, most men do the pride thing. Well, she can just leave then. And the only question I had of Barbie was, how was it that bad? We had examples of bad marriages in a couple of our friends. We knew what a bad marriage was and that didn't seem to apply. But it was those resentments. And Barbie was waiting on me to become the spiritual leader that I committed to her in our marriage, literally my wedding vows.
Right.
And I had gotten to a point in my life where our boat had floated out to the middle of the lake and the oars had slipped into the water and I had no way to get us back to shore. And I wasn't looking up and yielding. I was trying to continue to fix it and make everything right. Yeah. And everything was going wrong. Everything.
That comparison game is dangerous. I mean, and especially for my generation, because if you look at other marriages to try to compare, you could find one's way worse, way better, and then you're sitting there playing this comparison game. But really, it's between you and God and you and that person, and focusing in on those moments that matter. And like you said, as a guy, I totally get it. There's times where we're just not even seeing it. It could be like a bright neon flashing sign, Greg, be home more, whatever. And we just go right because we're trying to make it work. And like, I love how you made that point of like doing it yourself and then praying for God to bless it afterwards. Like so many of us, I feel like, find ourselves in seasons of that rather than, going to the Lord first and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? Like, what's your plan? But
you really say you want to hear from God, but you really have your own rathers.
Hear this part, and then tell me what you think about it after I already do it.
Right?
Yeah. But
I was putting the stuff on the plate every day and presenting it. And it was empty as far as he was concerned, and I had a lot of regret. But they say that thing about you go through a valley and you look back and you wouldn't take $1 million for the experience of the learning. And God's used me in other people's lives of what I went through to speak to them, not in judgment and saying, well, let me tell you how you mess up. I was always humble. God would actually have me relive it in front of people. I would relive all the pain and my big apology to Kaleb even when I leaned on God heavily and I said, he knew my frame. And I was left in that silence. Heaven was as a brass, and for a period of time. But then the holidays came. She'd been gone for a month and a half, and it's Thanksgiving. And I think I was getting a little selfish. But your dad had a prayer meeting at his home, and it was entitled, You're Hearing from God. And I was leaving there thinking, yeah, well, that's good for all them, but I'm not worthy. There's no way I'm going to hear from God. But he prayed with me before I left. And I got home, and I stood in Caleb's room, and I said, God, I really need to hear from you. It wasn't some long drawn out prayer. I didn't put the sackcloth and ashes. It was just, I need to hear from you. And by the next morning, the answer came. And you remember the name Garrett Morris that shared Save the Males, the radio. He had like a podcast for its day on the radio, on AFR radio on weekends. And I'm sure Pastor John knew him well. But I remember running into him on the grocery parking lot one day, and I told him what God had told me, and he said, "Oh, that's great." He said, "That's God." He said, "Can I use that?" I said, "Absolutely. It's not mine. I don't own it. God told me." But God's word to me was, "You can have your answer today or my answer tomorrow." It was that clear. It was as if it was spoken to me. And I immediately knew what that meant, that if I acted on what I wanted to do in the now, and I wanted to reach out and say, "You need to be home, we need to start working to make this better, blah, blah, blah," and God had told me in the beginning, after your dad had prayed, he said, "You're going to depend on me completely for the first time in your life. And this will be, you're going to walk with me. It doesn't matter what you hear from the well-intentioned people of the church, the elders, your best friend. If it's not me, you don't act."
Yeah.
And when I got that, message, I felt obviously humbled that I got to hear from God. Again, kind of a first-time experience, if I was honest, about that kind of message, where it's almost like the clouds parted. And I remember getting a night right after that happened with Kaleb, and he come over to spend the night with me for a change, and our relationship was fine. He was not quite 13, still right in the middle of 12. And I went up to his bedside, and I began to just bawl, and apologize to him, and saying, "I'm so sorry, for becoming that dad, and he's, of course, as a 12-year-old, and he's quick to forgive, he's saying, "It's okay, Dad, it's okay." He's letting me off the hook. And I said, "Well, I want you to know that." And I was just weeping, but he was excited, when I told him what God had said. And he said, "You mean tomorrow? He wanted to see us back together. And I said, "No, Caleb, that's God's tomorrow. And it could be months, it could be a year, it may not." I said, "I don't know." And I'll say this, and we got to get on to the key reason you and I met tonight. But God dropped an iron curtain between Barbie and I during that time. There wasn't texting, constant messaging. We only communicated the absolutes. It wasn't deliberate on either part. It wasn't pride saying, "Why should I give you It was none of that. My pride was laid aside. When we ended for that time, my heart wasn't hurt so much as the Barbie and I having the relationship that each day we walked hand in hand into the sunset, and I'd lost that. It was really, it's a 70-30 thing. 70% of the deep ache that never left my soul for that 8+ months we were apart was me having let God down. That was my biggest hurt from a lifetime of kind of phoning it in, and a lot of my Christian life being a lot of pavement of intentions to do better.
Yeah.
I'd even said about your dad, I was involved in his salvation and me going from him, our partying years, we called it, you've heard me say our Cheech and Chong years.
Yeah.
But I knew that when I rededicated my life, I thought I don't want to lose that friendship with him, and he wouldn't have understood at the time, and he didn't. As spiritual was vague to him and at arm's length. And he just saw the traditional Catholic formula.
Right.
And his particular experience, he said there was no life in it for him,
Yeah.
But disclaimer, that's not to say that that's the thing but any traditional religion, It doesn't matter what it is, Baptist or if it's tradition and it's not Jesus, it's gonna have issues,
correct,
or lack of life. But anyway, I used to say of your dad, I was introducing him to Jesus and continued to after he was saved in 84. And I said, Kelly went on to be an Eagle Scout in the Lord, and I stayed a tenderfoot, it's kind of that analogy.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm a survivor, I guess, of things. And I guess another key thing that instead of, we could make another sit down about mine and Barbie's separation and how God intervened and what I learned through that.
Yeah.
But one big lesson from that was, let me think how that played into, lost my train of thought there for a second. I said I was a survivor. When God spoke to me that day that your dad prayed over me, I was caught away, and I'm not going to delve into that because that would be another whole testimony. I never experienced that. I would say it was like falling asleep, sitting on a stool while your dad was praying for me. And but you don't know when you go to sleep. You just do, and you wake up.
Right.
That's the only thing I have to hinge on that in the natural, that's what God did for me. He fully got my attention and took me to wherever he was at. And he spoke over me a very chastising message about my life. But I felt so humbled that he did it.
Wow.
Because I didn't feel worthy. But as I faded out into that abyss, I was bawling from here so hard, I was almost vomiting a cry out of just whatever label you could put on that. Despair and shame of I've blown it. And not knowing the answers, what's going on, and I'm now, here I am again, God, I'm reaching out to you. And, but that went away. I didn't know consciously what I was doing. But he showed me in my life, he said, you're like a moth. He showed me an outside light, like a street light. And he said, you see that big moth coming back and bouncing off the globe. And he said, the center of my will for your life has always been there, and it's the light. But you hit the globe and you go back out into your darkness. You loop out and you do your thing, and you come back and you get close again, and then you bounce away. Anyway, I could really go a distance on that, but
it's so relatable, especially for me growing up in church and feeling like I lived a life like that where I had it all figured out, or so I thought, and then I just kind of kept on running into the darkness. So what you're saying really strikes a chord in my heart too, of even just my shorter life, just having that revelation. I think a lot of that is like a fresh sense of a fear of the Lord, a holy fear of the Lord that you experience in that moment. A true repentance. I think the Lord's been putting that on my heart heavily lately. When you read the Old Testament and you see these people and these prophets repenting but they're getting chastised a little bit. You know what I'm saying? They're getting a little bit of judgment that it's like, wow, even in that.
They don't even interpret it always, though, as it's maybe God trying to get their attention.
And even through all of it, they say God will be faithful. God will save us. They always, at the end of it, always have hope, but they're always repenting and looking to God in those moments. I think sometimes in our generation and maybe the church today, sometimes we do the prideful thing and we boast ourselves up and say, I don't need, if God's going to treat me like this, then I don't need him. But it sounds like to me you had the total opposite reaction, which I think is why God was able to pull you out of that.
Oh, I was humbled. I was humbled. He had showed me that I was part of that vision, if you want to call it that, not to get wordy with it, but it just was what it was. He showed me my grandmother when I was in my stressors in life in my 20s of job and questions of, things in life going on that gets to be pressures and things that you bring on yourself usually. And my grandmother, the spiritual anchor in my life, she'd say, Greg, after I would vent to her about whatever's going on, then she'd say, your scripture is Matthew 6:33. If you'll seek him, first in your life, and these other things will fall into place. And then I would give her, this is God replaying this, just like taking me back to that day. And he showed me, patting her on the back at arm's length, saying, I know, Mama, I love you, gotta go. And he said, that's how you've done me all these years. He said, you've done me the same way. I love you, but gotta go.
Wow.
Gotta go back to me. And then the key thing about the Kaleb thing here, about that message I got that day, Kaleb was a part of that. I just didn't know it at the time. But this is an attention getter for anybody that would have ear to hear. That's that thing about God's not doing it to you, but he's just letting you know things are going to unfold. He said, he described it to my heart. He said, you've been able to live your life kind of like you watch these tragedies on the news and you see the house being pushed away by the flood, but you're not really empathizing. You know, you're thinking, oh, that's a shame, man. But he said, that's not happening to you. And he said, from this point on, you're going to have some challenges. That's the word. He said, you're going to have some challenges in your life. He said, but you're going to have learned from this that you're going to look and lean and know you're going to depend on me. And little did I know that would take the shape of cancer. Barbie and I, when we got back together, it was a financial hurdle for like 2 years to just heal and do damage control and a 7 days a week work quest. And it was just, you know, but God gave us that thing about not putting on more than you can handle. You know, it seemed like it sometimes, but and the challenge of we'd lose a son, you know, and there's others, but that's the key, you know, cancer, loss of a son, how much more, you know. I wasn't Job at that point, but everybody going through something like that, you do feel like it at a given point, you know.
Yeah, it's really, you know, not only just because we've talked, you know, a couple of times throughout the years and just, you know, here and there, whenever you reach out, I try to reach back. But I see a lot of people going through the loss of a child in my church, in my life. And so I thought it'd be a good opportunity to have you on to kind of just share more about that experience, hear more about where you are now, because I know this is something that's always going to be part of your story, always with you. You know, I wear the tattoo for Kaleb on my leg. So Kaleb's always with me too. And even with Zach was like my best friend growing up, and I'm still, you know, in connection with his mom and stuff. And so it's just really hard to see these people broken. Do you feel broken?
You know, it's funny. Right as I was leaving, a couple of things rushed over me, and I was speaking it to my text to say it, to not leave it out. And what you just said addresses that, and I saved it in a screenshot here, so I don't take it too much time. I would say that it would be what this has given me is a witness. Let me see here. I think I'm on the wrong page, Daniel. Yeah,
it's
here
okay.
It is. I had made a couple of notes. I said the prodigal aspect as a reminder. And here it is. Kaleb's passing gave me a life witness, maybe not to those who might say, but I've already lost my child, but to those whose children are still with them. It could be hurtful for them to have regret, to read the part of this that God did get Kaleb's attention like he got mine in the last days of his life, you know, in a big way.
Yeah.
And so he rededicated, and we knew that heaven was his home. But nobody still wants to lose your son. You know, we see commercials with people of like Kelly's now surrounded with how many? 9 grandkids all of a sudden, you know?
Yeah.
In what seems like such a short amount of time. And Barbie just bathes herself with saying, man, I would hate to have the responsibility of grandkids in the way things are in the world some days, you know, that would be anxiety for her. But I think she would trade it, you know, if we knew that we'd wonder what kind of Kaleb's family would have looked like, you know.
Yeah.
But that's something that I wanted to mention as a mentionable thing, that I'm cautious when I hear that a parent has lost a child, and I'm thinking, but if they had no hope that the child had a relationship with God and was saved, it's like, then it's just, is it going to add to their despair? And I try to share it with a lot of people before that happens.
Right.
And, you know, there's some things that you and I didn't talk about, and you've read the letter and you know about it. And I may have mentioned it that day that you played guitar while I shared it a couple of years ago at our church. But I mentioned that about, I said I didn't want to scare people into thinking that, gee, if I dedicate my child to the Lord, he's going to take him away from me, you know. if that's the case, err on that side always, because you want them covered in wherever they go. That's one thing I said about Kaleb. When an 18-year-old is living their daily life, we were just filling in the blank. You don't know how they're really living their daily life, only other than what they communicate to you.
Right.
The rest is you're just catching it on the peripheral. You don't really know. That's why we didn't know he had done this major turnaround,
Mm-hmm.
And I think he knew that if he shared it with me, that I was going to take it like a bluff, like, yeah, right. You're just excusing the sin, the things that you still want to do. But that day that Kaleb and I had gone through the typical season of pulling apart, the tug of war with him wanting to do his own thing, and it was crossing, even though he had it great with us, a light discipline, and he didn't think so. But he did. He figured it out later that he had it pretty good with us as parents. But I was a realist with him. I didn't keep things from him to an extreme, but I talked to him about those extremes. And when I challenged him about that, I knew he was blazing up every now and then. I'm saying, I said, Kaleb, my growing up in the 70s, that's a different era. And I said, something today can follow you home as a result of dabbling in that life. It's different.
Yeah.
And it's the old wrong crowd application, that, but he'd say, I know, Dad, I got this, man, God's got this, and then I found out later, some of the guys would say, even when Kaleb was in the circle, after partaking, he would talk about God,
Yeah.
And that was I got a grin on my face when I would hear that, because I said, that was me.
Yeah.
Because I was saved young and I knew better.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wrote a letter to my classmates for our 45th reunion. And after the class president, finished his part, uninvited, I ran to the microphone and I said, guys, forgive me, but give me a minute. And I read it, and it was right from my heart that I had written as fast as I could write right before we were to be there. And it was, the title of it was, I Knew Better. And it was like a written apology to them that I didn't live it in front of them, that the life I knew to live, but I chose willfully by the age of 14, I'm going to live life for Greg. And I had this Nazarene mentality that I didn't want to be a hypocrite. So I wouldn't pray. I wouldn't have a relationship with God, because I felt like, why would I involve God now in what I want to do? Because he's interested in me submitting my life to him. And that's a right thinking, but it was messed up in the sense that my willful trajectory in sin and doing what I wanted to do for that classic years of 14 to 21 and a half, probably 20, right about 22 when I rededicated my life. And the night that I rededicated, God showed me the foolishness. I'll never forget it. I was backing out of the revival that was up at Bryansburg, and Gary Palermo was the guy preaching the revival. I called him the Daffy Duck evangelist. He had this wild personality, preached spitting and this Daffy Duck. But man, what a blessing. I was even bringing the videotapes that the church would sell and showing them to your dad, trying to layer some, like, here's something from the other side, And but as I backed out and began to drive home, God took me on one of those rewind trips, and he showed me places in my life. He said, if the enemy had had his way, you would have been another headline. You would have died that night. He showed me 2 or 3 big examples that I relived in that rewind thing that you get, like seeing a mini movie, in milliseconds. And he said, but you were abiding under my shadow. He said that you were never out from under my shadow, even though you chose to live that life, but you truly gave your heart to me when you were a kid, and I protected you, and people could say, well, why didn't he do that for Kaleb? Well, it's a whole different path for a whole different purpose.
Right.
I got to stay around to make up for the lost time of who I didn't share in a way. But Kaleb got a big dose of Jesus and went out there and made this victory lap. And it's like God, his heavenly Father, knew his rebel heart, that he probably couldn't have retained that testimony to that level. And some people would have been let down, that look to the man, they look to the testimony, they look to the pastor in the pulpit for their energy. And a lot of people would have fueled off of Caleb's energy. But then if he'd have let them down in little ways, how people, I mean, I did that. I rededicated my life, and one of my buddy's wives judging me for having a beer, in front of them. And in that weird, her philosophy was, there's nothing wrong with beer. But if she saw me do it and I made a claim to higher things, then she chastised and challenged me and buried me over that. I didn't have the spiritual wisdom to do battle. She crucified me over, doing something that looked like sin. She said, "You call that sin? Why are you doing that?" And another one of those little lessons in life, that you. But that's how we saw Caleb's life, but that doesn't mean he wasn't still going to be redeemed. But he would have taken his path, his trajectory, and the highs and the lows, and the learning.
Yeah,
you all do the dropout thing for a while. You think you've blown it, and the devil starts lying to you the whole time, saying, "Well, there's no way back now. You've gone too far."
I think the victim mentality, or the what about this person ism. I think everyone does that game to some extent, and some people for all the wrong motives. There's truly good questions to ask God and go before the Lord and ask, but there are some that are just prideful and arrogant and full of hatred. But if we live our life doing that to ourselves, then what about what the Lord has dealt to you or to me? If the Lord's dealt something to me, then I need to be dealing with it here on earth, and I have to fulfill my purpose. So, as I've lost brothers like Kaleb, and I've lost Zach, and I've lost some of these other guys in my life at a young age, I could do that game too. Like, well, why wasn't Kaleb protected? Why didn't Zach make it that one night? Why couldn't he made it one night? Why couldn't he see my third baby boy be here?
It's that journey. I'm looking back in the learning. You asked me how are things now, and you look back over that amount of years, and we always miss him. We always loved him and would have wanted him with us, but we've learned so much that I've told you and a lot of people, and I've given this letter out, I've said, they'll be shocked when I say it's about the loss of our son, and this whole thing comes over them, oh my, and then they feel bad and embarrassed and don't know how to respond, and immediately I tell them, it's okay. I said, with Kaleb, it was more of a testimony for us than a tragedy. And I said, that's not always the case, but I guess my mission, part of what's driven me, and this, is I know when I get over the other side, Caleb's going to say, you did a good job, Dad. That's that you kept me going. You kept it going, what I was trying to do in that compressed amount of time. Yeah. And you told my story, and now look at these people that are up here because of it. I have no doubt, that it's going to be that way. And, when I've given this out, it's like my coffee. I create the product and I roast the beans and it goes out, but I don't really get the compliments back because I'm the time to make the donuts guy. Yeah. It goes out and I don't get the compliments. They're buying it off of a shelf or whatever somewhere, and I'm not hearing the feedback. And that's the way it is in these. I pray, and God has brought me to people time and time again. I'm telling you, it's not of natural circumstances when it happens. And sometimes I just do it out of obedience, like I see somebody and it'll be a little tap on the shoulder, like from the ether. There's one, give it to them, But I don't hear the feedback until recently. Crossed paths with a girl working at her job. Barbie was with me, so she wouldn't have felt weird about it, And as we talked a minute, I said, I've got something I want to give you. I'm going to drive home and I'm going to bring it back up here to you. And she said, okay. And she said how late she'd be there. And I deliver it. And this is cutting out the details, but to get to the heart of the matter, so I told Barbie, I'm going to run back to that place, being private because I don't want to expose the location and who it was. But I go back up there a couple of nights later. Barbie's about to go back out, work on the boat again. And I'm approaching it's a different girl. And she says, you're that coffee guy, aren't you? And I'm like, yeah. And she said, well, I loved your story. She said, I read that story about your son. And she said, now I have a story for you. She said, the girl you gave that letter to the other night, I've been praying and surrounding her for the last 6 months and inviting her to church. I wanted to meet my youth pastor. And she said she's been depressed, a lot of anxieties. And she said the night you gave her that letter, she called me late when she got home. And she said, a man gave me a story tonight about his son. And she said, now I know God wants me to go to church with you and meet and it just waved over me, and it's again, I'm putting it up, there. It's like, there you go, Kaleb. It's another life reversal, a potential complete turnaround just in me humbly sharing the story, And I'm also quick to say, I don't want to leave this out. Every time I give it out, I say the same thing. And I say, Barbie and I have no special claim to having been grieving parents. And I said, but we were an audience to the story. And I said, it's God's story after all. And it goes back to that day that when I'm glad we got here, because I almost didn't revisit that thing about the end of the season of him and I pulling at each other and it was getting that way. My dad had really gotten on to me and said, you need to get a hold of that boy. He was doing it old school, like get him by the collar and get a hold of him and get his attention, And if you remember that time that Kaleb had broken his hand over the discrepancy, the thing that he did on a weekend that he got found out in such a unique, really comical way. I guess God's got a sense of humor in how things get their sin found out.
You always get found out.
Yeah. But he retaliated, and then therefore he loved that job he had down at Little Caesars. They all loved him down there. He was just loving that job. He was loving the free pizza he was bringing home every night, and I was even getting some of the dividends, But he blew it, because of his reaction, and he broke his hand and, punching his fist in the floor. And, he and I would engage during that time. I had lost that father's original respect with him when I had that season that I abandoned him in a way. And God said there's no repairing that because it imprints on him, But Barbie always had his heart, a mother's heart. If she was upset with him, it wrecked his day. He and I would just be like I was the older brother, dogging each other out, and standing our ground, But if she was upset with him, boy, she just iced the cake that I had baked in anger, and she'd come in there and ice it in for him, and it just wrecked him. But anyway, at that end of that day, we were in the backyard, and he had gone through that time, and I tried the collar thing, And if not for the little bit of respect that he had left for me, he would have laughed in my face, but he kind of grinned, and he's like, his whole countenance said, Dad, what's up? This isn't you. What are you pulling here? And I said, I know, Kaleb. I said, just go on. I said, I just want you to do better. I said, I just want you to try to do better.
Yeah.
And he left, and I put my hands up to the sky in my backyard earlier that summer. He was not knowing he was going to be gone in October, but that was probably in early June. And I said, God, I'll yield him back to you. And I said, I'm done parenting. And I said, I want to preserve the relationship and have the relationship with him. and still sow into his life, but not be on him and just that continual contention, you know. And I said, after all, we are done parenting. He's just right on the edge of 18. And I said, that season is over. But I said, I yield him back to you. And I said, he always belonged to you. Mm-hmm. And I said, but I'm done with my parenting role, you know. And I felt the Holy Spirit tell me that day, I can work with that. And do you know, that is the whole, that yielding I did that day, God used that in such an integral part of this, of his death ultimately. But it's not the death, it's the rededication that he found himself doing. And he was fully committed to, like I did, from 14 to 22. Yeah. He was beginning. He was going to do that. And he'd gotten out from under parental guidance. He had the motorcycle, he had the girls, he had the job, and the motorcycle took him to the party. and that was full on, and Uncle Kurt, you know, that comes up later, that he was living with up there at Draftonville at the time, that he moved in with, you know, he knew that season in front of Kurt would be okay. But then who knew God winds up using Kurt as like a surrogate in our absence of monitoring his life, not challenging him, putting little drops of wisdom like, you better be careful. Yeah. But not parenting him. But I wouldn't have even thought to do things that God was giving Kurt unction to do, that he told us later, you know, that after Kaleb was gone, that he said, well, he told me about his rededicating his life, and he said, well, why? I didn't see you go down front. He happened to be with him at the church that day. Oh, yeah. And he, even as little time as Kurt had experienced salvation, he still related to going down front. Yes. And he said, I didn't see you do that. And Kaleb said, no, I didn't. I just prayed where I was at. Well, Kurt really didn't believe it. But you know what iced it for him was, he said, he tells me, and everybody's got to know the personality here of Chong, you know, the hippie guy. Yeah. He's not that guy to be apt, you would think he would not be the one looking and being this attentive. But he told me something I wouldn't have even thought of. He said when he first moved up here, his Bible never moved. And he said it was work clothes piled on it, you know, that. He said, but after he told me he rededicated his life, he said it was in a different spot every night. And Kurt, that's in the letter, the last phone conversation that I had with Kaleb, that he told me, you know, there's my lifetime friend from the 7th grade on that was, you know, that my hippie friend, you know, that guy from the flash from the past, you know, that era. And, you know, hey, man, you know, he's like, everything's cool, you know. And, but he's telling Kaleb, you know, to leave his door open at night. And because Kurt's listening to of all things, the Swaggart satellite ministry, gospel, Southern gospel. Now picture Cheech and Chong being into Southern gospel. You know, Metallica maybe, but not Southern gospel. And, but that's all he played. And Kaleb told me that, he said, you know, that thing about it really was working, Dad. I was having these awesome spiritual dreams, you know. But he never told me that he rededicated his life. He didn't tell me live and in person on the phone. But I could just tell he was lit up, you know, that something had changed. You know, he was real, just, I don't know. It's hard to describe.
He had, even still to this day, one of the biggest hearts of anyone I've ever known. And so when you see someone with that kind of potential fully dedicate themselves to the Lord, it's impactful, because you don't meet many people like that every single day. Like, he was infectious. There's a magnetism around him. Everyone in the room wanted to be around him. And it wasn't because he wanted to be seen. It's just because he had the biggest heart in the room. And he was always just so goofy and funny and just so lighthearted, and never seemed to take anything too seriously unless you really got him with one good jab. But he was just always so big-hearted. And I think that was a big part of what really imprinted on me and so many other of his peers, was that.
Well, he was me all over again, the way I was in school. Although I was known as Weird Thompson by some of the guys like your dad when we were younger. He's weird. But I had that heart, and Caleb and I, if we something we had so much, almost like genetically in him, was he hated cliques. He hated social division. He was just like I was. He wasn't the popular sect of school.
Right. He wasn't
hierarchy.
preppy or anything.
He was loved by everybody that knew him.
Right.
Now, I wasn't that much, but
and he hung out with everybody. All different types of people, 100%.
And that's why I was. He had friends. He reached out to the jocks and the achievers and the ne'er-do-wells and the whole whatever category. There's a dozen you can put him in, but he was going to be friends with everybody.
And his best friend was Chong too.
Yeah.
Because his best friend growing up was a stoner. And so he was all over everywhere, man.
Yeah. And so it's like even the parents that we had, parents told me after they found out Caleb had died, they said, so we heard this so many times from different parents, but theirs, it reminds me, they were in town and they said, Caleb came through your house and his buddies were with him, and he stopped in the doorway going by where we were in the den and said, "Oh, Randy and Renee's here," and he said he come in there and made his friends wait, and he come in there and made us stand up to hug him, and he just said that he never forgot that. And then other parents told us, Daniel, that, they said, your son was the only friend of our kids that was our friend too. And they said when Caleb was involved, everybody had to be involved,
Yeah.
And I loved that, and that was part of the balm that helped Barbie and I cope with death, but when God helped me write that one page that could, if I'd have written it in the natural, it'd have been a documentary, But
do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?
Yeah, go ahead. Read that key page,
and
then I'll read what Caitlin wrote about his funeral.
All right, guys, here we go. Barbie and I lost our son, Caleb, on Tuesday, October 8th, 2013. He was 18 and our only child. After his accident, grateful for our time with him, I was able to write this. Caleb had started home on his motorcycle on a country back road. He'd had supper with the family and had just driven away from their home when he heard a deer cross in his path. He laid the bike down, sliding toward a utility pole, where Caleb was struck in the chest and died instantly. The next night, as I set an alarm, I heard "Holding Nothing Back" for the first time. The song was playing again the next morning. Jesus, I don't want anything coming between you and me. It doesn't matter what I lose. Caleb could have written it himself at the time. It felt like he was assuring us that his life ending early hadn't just been a tragedy. Sorry, not trying to cry. We realized it more when we learned that on the day of the accident, Caleb had told a friend that he would die if it meant that that friend would make it to heaven. Even as his parents, we couldn't have known how he was living each day of his life, so it helped us to learn how much he was loved by so many. His friends said Caleb made us smile even when we didn't feel like it, and parents shared of their kids' friends. Caleb was the only one who'd been their friend too. This helped us to replace sadness with celebrating his life, where some assumed that we were in a sort of denial that we still had grieving to do. But God's grace has remained with us. Proverbs 23, 25 through 26, 2 Corinthians 12:9, Isaiah 41:10. Caleb was saved when he was still a boy in the classic church camp setting. I was at that church camp.
Where are you?
I was.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
A skate camp at Heartland or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Him and Zach. I was there.
I didn't know that.
That's so funny. Yeah, earlier in 2013 and into summer, his life became static and in a wide open manner. He was pursuing the distractions of an 18-year-old. But God rearranged his life in such a way that quieted him. bringing him back to what mattered in his life. He made the right choice, for it was after he died when we learned that Kaleb had rededicated his life, just a week before he was to leave us. And with only a few more days of life to live, he'd spent his last week telling his friends and their parents how he'd given his heart back to God and that he wanted the same for them. During his last week, they all shared how they'd gotten to see his familiar smile, that he was just glowing and he was on that Harley on a mission. 2 Corinthians 5:15 and 5:20. Many bike crashes are violent with lasting and sadder outcomes, but God allowed Kaleb's spirit to enter eternity like a breeze across the flame of a candle. Within the hour after he'd left this life, many of his friends began posting messages like, "Kaleb, I've seen life as a gift. I realize how I've been wasting mine, so I'm asking Jesus into my heart too." Barbie and I miss him, yet at the same time, we're no longer worrying about him. We remain so thankful in seeing what's continued to unfold in the way that God truly used his life for such a purpose. I've said it's been like crying when seeing a son hit a first home run. It's an odd way to say it, but we remain so proud of him. And even as we'd like to have kept him with us just a little longer, we're living out the truth of John 12:24. For unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself alone, but in its death, it bears much fruit. Barbie and I were truly not aware of how much grace God had given us until we needed a whole lot of it. In Kaleb's memory, so long for now, Greg.
Yeah, that's there's even a version that I've probably added a line in there, and it was, it's not all, you can't put it all in there, about my dad and the age he was and how it destroyed my dad for a time. He was about 80, and Kaleb was the first grandson that he had actually gotten to watch grow up and have a relationship with him by that age, because he had a trail of divorcing away from kids, and that he was estranged from the kids that he had in those families, or grandkids that his kids had, that were states away, in some cases,
Yeah.
And that's what hit him hard, the hardest. And, after you've read that, I'll read what Caitlin wouldn't mind me saying this. It's and she's a 30-year-old nurse at the hospital now, that he did some growing up with. But she wrote, I've always said that I wrote that letter and that was the cake, and she iced it in this single paragraph, that I think hits home with the people that read it as a witness. At the top of it, I said, being one of his closest friends, Caitlin wrote one of the single most illustrative messages. Having written it after his funeral, it rings true with similar stories shared by his many friends and their families in the weeks following the accident. We continue to learn of others who have made decisions of salvation, remembering Kaleb's impact in their lives, finding it expressed even in the notes left in a prayer box by his grave. Knowing this, while continuing to share his story, has truly allowed us to celebrate his life and the time that he was with us more than mourning the loss. And Caitlin wrote, your funeral was amazing today, Kaleb. Ever since I left, I haven't been able to quit thinking about what the pastor said. We all ask why. Why do we have to leave so soon? I believe the reason for your death was a wake-up call to your friends and family. You have and will continue to change so many lives, Kaleb. I know while sitting there today, I decided it's time for me to change. I've been pushing God away when I needed him most for these past few years because I wanted to do what Caitlin wanted to do. How familiar does that sound? I'm tired of being selfish. It was such a privilege to call you my cousin. One of the greatest, most goofiest guys. There's you again, how he was. The most goofiest guys you'll ever meet. I know you're up there having the time of your life. I'll need your help some days, but I'm going to make you proud. It's not goodbye forever. It's see you later. I love you. Rest in peace. And Carrie wrote at the bottom, she said, you've touched so many hearts in this world and changed the lives of those who had the lucky chance to be your friend. You made an impact in so many people's lives and still continue even though you're gone. Your life will never be forgotten. I love you. And we put part of Caitlin's message was etched on his gravestone. And it's not goodbye forever. It's so long for now, because Kaleb would say it that way, and
Yeah, I mean, man, Kaleb and I had such a unique friendship because of you and Dad being friends for so long. We kind of knew each other when we were basically like babies, and then we kind of like didn't hang out a lot until we kind of started going to the same school, and we kind of rekindled a friendship that never really got to begin. And so then through those middle school and high school years, we had really cool moments of really being able to bond. And I taught him his favorite song to play on guitar was Kentucky Anthem. And he came over one day and for like 2 hours, that's all we played. And Kaleb was so...
I thought you were going to say, wish you were here.
No, it was Kentucky. He loved Kentucky Anthem. He was a country boy at that time. He had switched over from a skater personality to full on country boy, boot wearing. I mean, the whole nine.
Larry the Cable Guy.
I mean, he literally woke up. He went to bed with the etnies on and like the skateboarder persona, and woke up the next morning with boots on and jeans. Like he transformed overnight. Me and my buddies still joke about that to this day. How it was he was that guy. When he decided something, it was game on. And so I taught him that song, and he was so meticulous with the guitar that each time he'd mess up a chord, he'd have to start from the very beginning. He couldn't just play through the mistake. And it was so frustrating. But I was like, Kaleb, just keep on playing. Yeah. It's okay. You'll get it figured out if you just keep on playing. But little moments like that, and I'm telling you, in that process of grieving with all of the people who knew him arguably better than I did, that was a special time that I don't think I've ever experienced with death before.
Well, you don't mind saying, I don't mean to interrupt, if you can hold that flow.
Yeah, go ahead.
That day you started bawling in front of me when I gave you the card at your wedding.
Yeah.
And that was 7 years after it had happened. Mm-hmm. And I've said to many, many people in giving that out, I said, usually when you're at that age and tragedy happens amongst your friends or something like that, I said, it cuts really deep. I said, but because you're 17 or 18, you have a resilience and life is going on for you so at such a fast pace, you grow into your own life and it becomes a memory. But his impact on lives were so close to the bone that here you're on your wedding day and you got that is in your foremost in your heart and mind.
Yeah.
And I give you a card, which I filled up both pages, on the sides of the card, but I wrote that one line. And I was saying about your wedding, I said, if Kaleb was still here with us, he'd really be dogging you right now, which I had said that in a banter, a funny sort of way. And you start crying in front of me, and I'm going, I'm sorry, Daniel, I didn't mean to make you sad on your happiest day. And you gathered yourself and you said, you don't understand, man. I love that you wrote me this. And then I remember some of the guys gathered around that knew him, and I began to talk about that last phone call with him, and you talking about, you were one of the ones that saw him that last day, and Kayla's mother, and she was the one that told me, Barbie and I, she said, Kaleb come up my sidewalk that morning and I was planting flowers, and she said, I heard that. She said, I looked up and saw his familiar smile. She said, but he was just glowing. And when she said that, I mentioned that in the letter. I'm kind of going to be redundant, but
no, it's okay.
But that she was one of them that got my attention. When I said that to you at the wedding, at the reception, you were sweeping your foot, not trying to cry again, and you said, man, you just don't know. And you just, like you confirmed that. You said you just don't know what it was like to be around him that during that time,
Yeah.
Which I would have loved to have. We only got a glimmer.
Yeah.
He'd come by the week before he died, probably a week and a day, and the Camry had been making a noise, and he wanted me to drive it around the block to see if I thought there was anything about to go wrong. He had that filthy shirt on from working, and when I drove out, he was trying to hug Barbie like coming at her like I'm going to hug you and get this all over you. And she's back. She's saying, "You're not hugging me." And he's laughing, just that usual mode. And that was the last time I was around him. That was the last time I would see him. But
it could be 6 months before I really got a chance to hang out with him. Like, we didn't hang out every day like some of him and his best friends did. He had friends that he was closer to. But when we hung out, it was just like yesterday. And he was so honest and open and real. He would ask me for advice on things. I think he really valued that from me. And so, he would just give me the whole story. He would hold nothing back. So it was like we were best friends without even having to see each other all the time. He was just always so honest and real and like, hey, this is exactly what I'm dealing with. Always girl problems or something, At that age, that's what we struggle with. I hate
or getting caught doing something you weren't supposed to.
Oh yeah,
you guys were each other's support in the storm.
We knew what was going on. Yeah, I think.
Hey, I know that I needed to. I don't want people to leave your audience. I'm going to take a bathroom break right quick.
Yeah, please.
But since you can't pause it, they'll definitely want to stay tuned for me reading our last phone conversation. That's the thing that brings it home.
Okay, so that's no worries.
I'll be right back. Sorry, folks.
No.
Talk to him about Kaleb for a minute.
No, man. Yeah, it's one of those things like I'm thankful for the lesson Kaleb taught me. In a lot of ways, going through that, like he was talking about, cut you deep, and some people can kind of bounce back, but there was a lot of years where I was still catching myself crying, sobbing over Kaleb, especially if alcohol was in the picture. I talked about him basically every time I got drunk, back whenever I wasn't right. But it was more than just that. It was more than just my failures as I was facing them. It was because of how much of an impact he made. And that funeral service was probably one of the most impactful memories I have. So, I'm thankful for the lessons he taught me, though. You got this. What is this?
This is literally, it's what I called it our last, sorry.
No worries.
This was our last phone call, and I only started writing this after I shared that day and put pieces of it down as it would come to me. But I said, I'll just start. I said, as you read through this, it's my eccentric attempt to convey the conversation as close to having the reader to both hear and visualize what it was like to have had the original exchange with him. A glimpse into my last phone conversation with Kaleb 1 week before his entering eternity. I couldn't have known at the time, in my absence as his dad, Kaleb having moved to a neighboring county to stay with my lifetime friend, Kurt. And when I say lifetime, I mean he and I had ridden trail bikes, among many other memories, going all the way back to 1974 in our middle school days. And to think Kaleb would be born 21 years later. My last conversation with Kaleb was a phone call that gave me a glimpse into just one of the ways his heavenly dad was turning his life in a direction that was very different from the one that he was fully committed to pursuing, one of living life on his own, making up for lost time of living by the rules. In the latter months of his still being 17, Kaleb and I had gone through that typical season of pulling apart and him leaning into his independence. On a particular challenging day, probably in early June, I mentioned that I said, in acting on my own dad's old school advice to get a hold of him and get that boy's attention, I gave it my best at getting serious with him, and it fell flat. So much so that Kaleb held back with a grin instead of laughing in my face as I told him, just go on, Kaleb, I just want you to do better. After he left, I put my hands to heaven. I said, Father, I yield him back to you. He's always belonged to you, and though we've been his mom and dad, I'm done parenting him. And he's about to be on his own. I want to preserve a relationship with him over that of continuing to only challenge him. To that humble prayer, I felt God's Spirit say, I can work with that. Little did I know, with Kaleb no longer living with us, how that very word would unfold later that summer. It would become apparent how God had continued to shadow his life through divine providence. You could clearly discern, no matter how unlikely in the natural, that it could possibly be my lifetime friend, Caleb's Uncle Kurt, would end up being a kind of surrogate dad. And I call this chapter 2. I said, Kaleb referred to him as Uncle Kurt. Kurt always had a personality indistinguishable from that of Chong, half of the iconic comedy duo known as Cheech and Chong. It was just Kurt's natural persona all the way back to his youth. The popular phrase of the 70s and 80s, stoner, was inherently ascribed to him long before he'd even had his first beer. He was, they called him Stony or Stoner, you know, when we were working at Bonanza at the steakhouse washing dishes, and he hadn't even done anything, you know.
It's funny.
But, and though later in his life you could say it became a more accurate title, it's an important part of the story. I attached an image of Chong below in case you, the reader, are too young to remember the pop culture icon from Cheech and Chong era more relevant to the 70s. Is there a way you can hold that to the camera?
Sure.
That was Kurt. That was Kurt in Caleb's life. So Kaleb had landed in such a party-friendly atmosphere, certainly aligned with Caleb's plans for the rest of his summer. And because of this, it is vital to consider the typical scenario that you would expect for such a season of a young life. Yet it's so much more unlikely that things were going to unfold in the way they did, especially given the environment that Kaleb was chasing, not to mention other circumstances that were happening around him at the time. There was a lot of stressors going on with the informants that were trying to do payback to Kurt over a situation. Kaleb was feeling some of that, you know, stress. So it wasn't the complete exonerated, free atmosphere that he'd hoped to land in.
Yeah.
But it's I'm probably, again, going to be repetitive, but it's so key to say this is really the miracle part of this whole story with Kaleb, because no one at that age, when you have it all, you've got it all. And it's like I said, that is the prodigal story in a way.
Yeah.
Because he left to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to start my life, you know. And how God intersected, and that Kaleb yielded to that. That's the impossibility. I've replayed that in my mind so many times. I thought that's just almost impossible. That why would he feel compelled that, he only experienced life the way he wanted it for years. He'd only experienced it for a matter of a few weeks, you know. And you could say, well, the sin wasn't fulfilling or this, but yeah, you only usually say that after somebody's done it for years and they've hit bottom, you know, and then they find themselves in jail or something, and then they're reaching up and saying, rescue me, you know.
Yeah.
But he made all this decision in a period of weeks. And, but I said, so it is all the more reason you have to get your mind around Uncle Kurt being not into the drug scene, but by the time Kaleb moved in, Kurt had gotten completely immersed in the atmosphere that was filled only and nothing but the continual sounds of Southern gospel ministry and music. Such was not the case just prior to the time that Kaleb had moved in with him. That is a key part of Kaleb's final days in this life, for what he would ultimately tell me in what would turn out to be our last conversation. Kaleb was in a good mood, telling me how Kurt would never change the channel from the 24/7 flow of the Jimmy Swaggart Ministries Network. And this is quoting Kaleb. He said, I'd come in from work and I'd tell Kurt, I can't take it anymore, Kurt. Put it on SpongeBob or something. he said, well, he would, but then it would go right back to the Swaggart Network. And I'll interject here. I said, so think about that ministry being played day and night, and Kurt's old hippie style of delivery. My lifetime friend would ultimately tell my son, Kaleb, man, you need to leave your door open at night, and it'll give you good dreams, man. And I said, even over the phone, I could just tell that Kaleb was inspired and lit up as he continued, quoting Kaleb again. He said, and Dad, it really was working. I was having all these awesome spiritual dreams, but I had to quit after a while because I wasn't getting enough rest for work. In that conversation, Kaleb hadn't actually put into words that he'd rededicated his life to Jesus, figuring that I would just give him a yeah, right response, from me taking it as a bluff to cover for his newfound freedom in living with Uncle Chong. And of times that we would talk about such things, and when I would caution him, already aware of what he was into, his comebacks were always along the line of, okay, it's okay, Dad, man, God's got this. Yet in Kurt saying something so simple, becoming so profound, being spoken into his life, it completely changed Kaleb's intentions and his direction. We only discovered an example of this in the spring of 2024. I had just shared his story at our church on what would have been his 29th birthday. Not long after I received a call from Lily, one of the twin sisters he'd grown up with from the time they were together as kids in Sunday school and with whom he'd stayed very close. I'd said something to her from my memory of Kaleb having been with them at their home that night, the night of his bike crash, which would happen within only moments of his leaving their driveway. This conversation with Lily being 11 years after he was gone, I had no idea of the surprise that I was about to hear. She said, Greg, I wanted Kaleb to ask me to marry him, but he didn't want a good girl. He wanted a bad girl. And then she delivered the greater news. She said, Greg, he wasn't coming out there to see me and Abby. He had been coming there to talk to my dad about Jesus. She said, yeah, he'd been coming out for the last couple of weeks before the wreck, asking Dad all kinds of questions about Jesus. It just put me in awe all over again that he was taking that newly rededicated heart to everyone, inspired by those exchanges with her dad. We'd also learned something that just fits this prodigal story. 3 people had crossed his path on the last day, 2 being his closest friends, and you were one of them, One thing that they expressly shared, that Kaleb had walked up with that familiar smile, and that he looked at them, he was glowing. My using prodigal symbolizes his life at the time and the miracle, because although he was only dealing with the leftovers of our parenting, he had still left home. He had gained the freedom to have and do everything any 18-year-old would want to do. He had the motorcycle to take him to the job, the girls, and the party. Who, in such a time of doing whatever they want, whenever they want, would ever be interested in turning back to God in a renewed discipline? He hadn't stumbled into trouble that had ruined his self-driven goals. Nothing had happened that had wrecked his life, and then he felt like, I've got to crawl back to God. Mm-hmm. He had the world by the tail, and therein is the miracle. In his final hours, he'd become so filled with God's Spirit to an actual glow, taking that energy to everyone, inviting them to accept Jesus. Kaleb was telling them that he wanted to make sure that he'd have them in heaven, have them as his friends with him forever in heaven. At this point, you may already be familiar with his story, what you read from my testimonial letter that we call Remembering Kaleb. If so, then I can close with, and now you know the rest of the story. Thanks for taking the time in earnest, Greg and Barbie and Uncle Kurt. And you guys, one thing that just jumps out at me, one of the examples of that was the girls told us how they would drive around, they would load up Kaleb's Camry. Were you with them on some of those nights that they would all get in the Camry?
I don't think so.
They said that Kaleb would ride in the back seat of his own car and have one of them drive, and he he would tell them he'd have them put it on Kaleb radio, and they said he would sing with all those songs just as loud as he could yell it.
Yeah.
And they said after all, he wasn't singing, he was terribly off key, but he was still just having a blast, and just yelling the songs at them, And they just said it was the greatest, And then that's what they would express it, that's what caused them to be so brokenhearted, that then he's there and then he's gone, and he's living that full life energy in front of them, and they're just like, we can't take this for granted, this is like, we're going to enjoy this for a long time, And then all of a sudden he's singing those messages to them, and they're not even aware that, it's something that he's going to leave, impart to them as he leaves this life,
Yeah.
And no, I'm not saying that Kaleb was comparable to a Messiah, but to his friends that made a choice to say that Jesus is real, and he proved it. Kaleb helped to prove that to me, because they knew the former Kaleb, they knew how he always was.
Mm-hmm.
And, but, those kind of stories, Daniel, like I said, we knew nothing when he died. And we just saw the cop coming up our sidewalk that night and saying, it was really dark that night. And I'm seeing the figures move out of our yard, like Kayla and her mom, and she's crying, and you're just in this slow motion. Your mind hasn't landed on anything. And Barbie trailed a little bit behind me. She's like, what's going on out here, party, and I'm looking out in the darkness, and I see the police car before I saw the officer on our sidewalk. And I immediately picture, well, he's late. He didn't come by here to talk to us about the motorcycle, of all things. We were going to lean on him about getting rid of it,
Yeah.
And Barbie's aggravated with him, and she's thinking he's already driven back to Draftonville. And when I saw the cop car out there, I'm thinking immediately, I thought, I can't see it, but he's bent over the back of it with the handcuffs, being put on him, what has he done, And then I remember Kayla's dad, Jeremy, was in front of the cop, and I said, where is he? And I said, is he out there? And Jeremy said, no, man, you need to talk to him, the cop. And then the cop begins to say, hey, your son's, I don't even remember exactly how he phrased it. But Barbie had gotten the message before I did, as I turned back my attention back to where she was all of a sudden hugged up to Austin's mom and crying on her shoulder. And she turned to me and said, he's gone. That cry of a mom's voice, just penetrates me to this day. And but you can't imagine, that, again, we had none of this to go on, none of the good stuff,
Yeah.
Just he's on his way to talk to us, and then you hear he's gone, and you're like, you're just, you're in it's a blur. You don't even, it's like you're watching a movie, and it's just so weird when I replay that in my mind. And I just wanted to pull her back in the house, away from it. And we went all the way down the hall, and I sat on the side of the bed, and she's crying, and I just squeezed her hand, and I'm just praying, or Jesus, what's happened? Just Jesus, I don't, again, it's such a blur. But of all of it that's blurry in the details of that night, that officer approaching us in the dark, it was so dark. I couldn't even see him until he got within almost as close as you are to me. And the look on his face, and I turn and I see Barbie's crying and saying that in my face, But then the grace that I talked to in the letter is God began to let us know how beyond okay it was. The first things I wanted to know was, where did he die? And I want to go to that spot, and I want to see where he left this life and went into eternity. And Barbie didn't want to go.
Yeah.
You know, she didn't want to, but she understood. And I said, I want to go. I want to see. It's almost like, to me, it's like the mother said that just literally took it badly. You know, she like had to have therapy for the year after that about when Kaleb had just left their home and she had fed him. And then he went right up the hill and died, you know, and she came back in the house after the sirens were showing up, and she said, oh my God, his breath is still in my home, you know. And I guess I kind of felt that way. And I rode out there with a buddy, and then our pastor followed us in a vehicle. And it was about 2 a.m. He had died about 9 that night. And when I looked up, you think those things, you think, did God do that for me? You know, one thing the pastor said, God did it, God did it. He was excited because part of the answer, we looked across the road and there was like 25 deer of all sizes looking at us, sitting, just standing there, just the whole herd was in the backyard. Like, it was just so unreal.
Yeah.
You know? And you know that God can arrange things like that make a provision in these subtle ways. And I wasn't looking for some answer at that. I was too early to be asking questions of why, you know. Well, that was kind of came to the point of the funeral and the theme of the funeral. But we were already beginning to know why before we even had the funeral. The night we opened our home to all you guys, and there was like 20 of you in the house that night, and just to spend time with you guys. And all of his friends began to tell us the stories of his last days with them and what he was doing.
Yeah.
And that made all the difference just right out of the gate. And made the funeral, instead of empty, but it gave it purpose, you know. And then his own grandfather preacher preaches his funeral, you know, along with Brother Ferris. It was a 2-preacher funeral. And to think that Barbie's dad had the strength and the God-given wherewithal to preach his own grandson's funeral.
Yeah.
And just really bring it home about that. We all ask why, but you don't always have to have the answers in this life. But we were already feeling the answers were coming to us, you know. And but I just it you know, that's the thing that I always try to let people know, that I don't feel like we can make a special claim to the grief that some parents go through in different situations that don't know. But I want them to know this, because they can be prepared and they can take care of what matters in this life. And if they get their lives right before God, then they have the Christ on the cross bought and paid for right to plead his blood that he shed over their lives every day that they leave their presence and they go out into whatever may happen. And you can't be mad at a God that gives you had that option. You know what I mean?
Right.
You know, I would never say that to a parent that just lost their child, but I can say it to them while they still have their kids.
Right.
And of all those kids that I went to school with, that I stayed quiet, I lived for Greg in front of them. I didn't live a hypocrite. I didn't go to church and do the church thing on Sunday and then come and live like show Greg in the halls of the high school. I lived for Greg. But it's almost like, in a way, I felt like I was almost like saying thanks to Kaleb. I said, it's like God said, Kaleb paid your debt. You know, he did what you wanted to do, but you didn't. Kaleb made up for it.
Right.
And that's the energy that drives me, the witness, that we don't share this as, gee, look what we went through. You know, look at we lost a son, read our story.
Yeah.
It isn't that. It's read this to know that even if you have given your heart to the Lord, and it's not about church and a religious plan, it's literally you getting accepting Jesus in your life instead of going into eternity having rejected him, knowing him. And that is the drive, is to, know him while you still can,
Yeah.
And who's to say, that's where you get into the religious or scriptural philosophies. Was Kaleb, would he have still been saved when he had the wreck? Because he had some sin in his life. Well, I tend to believe that his salvation genuinely gave his heart to the Lord, just like you said you witnessed,
Yeah.
And you see the evidence in his coming home, what he shared, how he continued to live. God doesn't take that back away from you because you mess up. But we all go through seasons, of life.
Right.
And Kelly and I, your dad and I, heard a guy that with really good intentions preached our Sunday school class one morning when your dad and I were in our mid-20s. And he was saying there's no gray area in sin. It's all black or white, which is a lot of church dogma can be that. And I kind of choked him up with a little bit of wisdom I had at the time. And I said, if Charles Manson were to be saved tomorrow, he's going to need a lot of gray to operate in his newfound salvation. He's going to have years of learning and growing, and he's going to mess up and he's going to say bad words and until he gets wisdom and learns and grows in Christ, in Jesus. You don't get it all when you get saved. It's a learning and a growing.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about this on the phone whenever you called me the other day. And grace covers sin regardless of whether it's black or white. There is something to be said about sin being sin, right being right, wrong being wrong. There are verses that talk about forgive me for the sins I don't even know I'm committing. And I think there is more grace for those than there are for the ones you do willfully. I think there is more judgment for willfully sinning, even if you know, hey, I shouldn't be doing it. I think there is levels of sin, personally, just from my reading of the scripture. But I tend to agree, not that we don't have to hash out right here, right now, that sin is black and white. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But grace, what Christ did on the cross, that sacrifice alone paid it all. And no matter if I sin right now and then my life is gone and forfeit here, I still believe I know where I'm going to be because of the faith I have in Jesus.
You're not. Then it's based on a salvation of earning and merit badges.
Yeah, it's not a work-based faith. We don't believe that we're saved by every single little thing that we do. We're not tallying.
I grew up feeling that way. I grew up feeling I was on the sin roller coaster.
Because
I'm saved
what
today.
happened to Kaleb was radical, and he wasn't even, like you said, there was still a lot to learn. As you grow and mature in Christ, God is constantly showing us things that we could correct in our life that are sinful areas of our life. Oh man, I've had a blind spot to that for years. It's time for me to start correcting that.
Yeah.
Oh man, I need to stop watching whatever that is because that is putting, lustful thinking or what. There's so many things. There's so many avenues and where we can sin. I was about to go somewhere I'm not going to, but you see it everywhere. And who are we to pick at someone else for a sin when we got a log in our own eye, right?
Yeah.
We might see someone who's a little overweight and say, well, they're struggling with gluttony.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're not dealing with our own sin at home, right? So that kind of comes back to that repentance you had in that moment way back whenever you needed God more than anything else. And he said, that's your answer.
Yeah.
That's your answer.
Yeah.
I've been doing this deep dive into Luke and seeing what walking by faith looks like from Jesus's perspective. And not only Jesus, but the way people encounter him. And the prostitute who sobs at his feet, cleans it with her hair, and puts perfume over his feet. That's what walking by faith looks like. And she was forgiven of all of her sins, and they were many. That's what walking like by faith looks like. Not trying to justify my sexual sin, or not trying to justify my acts and say, well, God would be okay with this. Jesus would forgive me of that. No, I'm going to go to his feet and ask for forgiveness. And then that's where you receive it, at his feet. So I don't know. There's a whole lot we could go into with all of that. And I totally hear what you're saying with the gray. I think the gray is more of grace.
That's what I was getting ready to interrupt you with. I should have made that clear, that I didn't mean you can get by with gray sin.
Right.
I meant God allows it. It's all based on, well, I guess you could almost sum it up with that scripture that people make about money in error. But it's not about money. It's about everything, that to whom much is given, much is required.
Yes, yeah.
And that is the opposite of ignorance, that is bliss.
Right.
If you're completely ignorant, God's not holding you accountable. But you know in your own heart and mind what you're doing. You already know the difference. Isn't that what is the scriptural basis for really God gives every man the ability to sense conviction, or the sensitivity to what's right and wrong. You know the difference.
Paul talks about your conscience and your spirit, and like sinning against
That's put in there by God when you're conceived. You know, it's part of your soul.
Right, for sure.
Recognition of that, but knowing all the principles and the things that God calls sin, a lot of people are ignorant to that to a certain level until they've had time to grow. I think that's where it comes about, not judging others,
right?
Because you don't know what level they're at.
Yes,
you're just judging what you saw.
Yeah, we don't know their heart, right?
Yeah, and that's what I said. I had that little lesson about.
You were more focused in on the heart.
Yeah, and like when I was freshly separated from my first wife, and I'm down there and I have the beer with my buddy. I wasn't doing the male thing. I'm gonna go get drunk,
Right.
I was fine. I was still capable of witnessing to my buddy that offered me the beer, but it's like I didn't take that like, okay, I'm gonna get a buzz now, I deserve it, So I knew where my heart was at, but boy, she latched onto it for the visual evidence that, you're selling out a little bit here, because she had never said a word to me about my Christian existence in front of her prior to that.
Yeah.
But when she saw me do what looked like, it's funny how that worked. She had no Christian principles of evaluating, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, she had one.
Yeah.
She saw this example.
That's why there's so many fractures in our church families today, and I wish we could get past it, because we're in a broken world that's breaking harder and harder every day. We need more Jesus, and Jesus isn't division or looking at one another and pointing out sin.
Where is it in? Help me out here. Is it in Isaiah? It's literally a simple answer to a lot of things too. Like I said, that about to whom much is given, you're required by what you're aware of.
Yeah.
And the other one is concerning the weightier matters, I would not have you ignorant. That's paraphrasing the scripture, but it's that thing about religious separations that we have. The world looks at that and says, the devil uses this to say, see, it's all a debate. So why bother? It's all they're debating among themselves.
Yeah.
And but that's because if you stuck to the things that really matter, then you wouldn't have all the division and the questions of predestination. People do deep dives on that. Well, you were always intended to be saved, and this guy was always intended to be a criminal.
Yeah, I
That's
know.
not true. It's that word in the Bible that says he predestined us all to know to be his. That's almost like saying he wished for all of us to come to him willingly, and to accept Jesus and love God, on our own.
Yeah, we got to make Jesus the Savior and our Lord first and foremost above all else. If we can all agree on that, we can discuss theology a million times over, but that's what we got to agree on. And the fastest way to live a life without sin or with as little as possible is to live by the Spirit. Romans talks about it in depth. If you want to live free, you're going to be a slave to righteousness or a slave to sin. And living by the Spirit is the key to it all. The law is still good and right, but living by the Spirit is what sets you free.
Yes.
And it sets you free from sin. And Romans 5 through 9 or
legalism
whatever.
and rules dry you up.
Yes, and Paul talks about that wrestle in his flesh of all that because of all the people, he knew the law like the back of his hand. He was one of the guys who held the coats while they stoned the Christians. He knew that law like no one else in this generation really does, except for the rabbis who are still out there. And still, so he's having this radical revelation of this spiritual insight. It really is transformational.
Well, that's why I said I couldn't. Kaleb certainly didn't have all the. He was heart driven.
Yes.
And when he wore that heart filled with Jesus on his sleeve, that's what people resonated with people.
John was just sharing in Corinthians Sunday. I wasn't there Sunday, but I listened to the sermon today. And he was just sharing in Corinthians just a little bit where Paul's talking about, I didn't come to you with fancy words or fancy this or I came with just Jesus. And that's like a perfect example of what Kaleb was like. Mm-hmm. He didn't have to have a fancy, articulate speech or some kind of crazy gospel line out. He just went with Jesus with him.
He wasn't giving out pamphlets. He was.
Yeah.
He was
just. He just had Jesus.
Yeah.
He didn't need all that. And that's where true wisdom begins, is fearing the Lord. And so he had wisdom and he had knowledge that people are like, whoa, who's this Kaleb? Where did he come from? You know what I mean?
That's the only thing I think that if have that thing where we'll drive away and I'll think, oh, I should have said this. I don't think I have any of those left as long as we've been talking about this. But the one that just jumped back at me is that this point about Kaleb, to summarize him and his purpose and his path. I saw God compress what I lived between 14 and 21. Mm-hmm. Classic 7 years as in my prodigal years. God compressed that into his life in about a year and a half. He lived all of that in a year and a half's time. Mm-hmm. And I saw it, but you don't understand it when you're in it. You only look back on it, and then it becomes clearer, what was going on. But so he took Kaleb through some, just this side of jail trenches. Yeah, he allowed him, the tether, to go out so far and get so much of it on you, and lie to your mom and do this and get caught. And I mean. It's the reason I said that just this side of jail is because Barbie had already told him, you get caught with what you're not supposed to have. We're not coming down to get you out of jail like a lot of parents do. That'll be your lesson. And Barbie was very set in that. And we were in agreement in that, which made it easier in our marriage. There wasn't any reversals between us. And, but he was about to experience that. He died on Tuesday night, and he had a Thursday court date to appear before the judge because he was doing the classic on that motorcycle. He had some weed in one of the bags, and they'd heard his Harley ride up at a place. Of all things, it's almost comical. It's like a scene out of a movie. They were looking for a guy. They were set to do a sting, almost like a SWAT level on a guy that was expected to be in the area. And he was on a Harley. And this was all set up. And one of the neighbors, when she heard the Harley, called the police and said, he's here. And it was Kaleb.
Wow.
And all the friends were there for the get-together, the party.
Yeah.
Real innocuous. It wasn't some blowout like Burning Man or something. It was...
Yeah.
But Caleb had just rolled up on this scene, it's like, and then they show up, it's like swarm. And Caleb, being good hearted, he pulled one of the officers aside and he said, I've got some, you're going to find it. He said, if a dog comes out of the car, he said, I've got a little bit on my bike. And the guy said, well, okay, they went easy on him because he was so come forward, with it. And what was so funny about it, the thing that I had to laugh about later through the tears period was the fact that he literally told the guy, I'm holding, which was always the go-to excuse. The guy gets pulled over. It's not mine. I'm holding for somebody else, It's in my glove box, But Caleb was in that same exact mode, with that young cop, he's, it's a friend, I'm holding for a guy, but I got to tell you, I've got it on me.
Oh my goodness.
But it just shows you the other journey, that he was aware, that he could have taken, earlier that summer.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that happened earlier that summer. He rededicates his life. All that happens, and then he leaves. And yet he had that appointment.
That is something
that he was still going to have to
face a misdemeanor
judgment.
charge.
Yeah.
Greg, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing some about Kaleb. And I think the audience knows that that's the reason we named our first son Kaleb. I
forgot to mention that.
Yeah, I was gonna lay that out in the groundworks of it all, but then we just started getting rolling, and I didn't get to. But if you didn't know that, pull that picture up closer.
I forgot. This would have been key. I should have started out. Is that close enough?
I think that'll be fine. I mean, I can't see the other side, but I think that'll be good. But
that captured him. That was that one capture taken not long before he was, just days before he was to go. That was like a capture of him.
Mm-hmm. But
you may have to edit this in 2 parts. Sorry.
No worries.
You may have to make.
No, I'm gonna release it. So the last episode I just did was 3 hours long.
Wow.
It was the longest of it. I was shocked. I didn't think I had 3 hours in me, but this woman and her husband came on, and she had a testimony like nothing I've ever heard before. She had been sex trafficked basically, and I mean, just her abused and used her whole life. I mean, every step of the way you're thinking it's going to get better, and it didn't. It was one of the most shocking testimonies, but this one is really hits home with me because it just brings back so much of my life and those years we've been talking about, those impactful years. And so I'm so thankful and grateful to get to kind of share with people not only a little bit of my story, but also a humongous part of yours. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I love the opportunity. And I'm still going to continue to give them out,
Yeah, if you ever see Greg, you got your coffee at Banks? Is there anywhere else you got it?
About Time Being Coffee.
Yeah, it's over there, right there on the coffee, like right when you turn right into Banks. If you want
by the birthday cards.
You want to try a new coffee brand and support our brother Greg. And if you see him out and about, get one of these flyers because another thing before we hop off here, I love that his story is touching the generation that when he passed, he was younger, and it's impacting that generation now.
Yeah.
A generation that needs it so much. I mean, I've served in the youth here. I don't right now, but I've served for 3 years or so in the youth here, and I play worship some for them. But just seeing this generation coming up, the teenagers of this generation, they need stories like this. They need that fire. They need that revival-like spirit to come upon them and hit them and impact them. So thank you for not letting his story die and letting him live through your story because he's still alive.
Yeah,
he's still living, and it only seems just to continue to use his testimony for what it was meant for, saving lives and bringing people to Jesus.
And not just that you could give copies to make these available to you to give to your youth here.
Yeah.
That's an option. And I even, or it would be profound if you just walked into their classroom one Sunday morning and said, you guys need to watch my podcast of a friend of my dad's that lost their son. You know, and just invite them to watch it. They might not take the time in one sitting, but I think there's enough there they'd want to catch up to it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to close it up.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Love you, Daniel.